Frost had set on the wire by 9:30, and that is how the shape was seen at all, because the fence had turned white and something whiter was moving along it. He was standing at the north corner of the compound with a hurricane lamp turned down low, which was the practice, because a bright lamp blinds the man carrying it and leaves everything past 10 yards a wall of black. So he saw it the way you see things at night in open country, not as an object, but as an absence, a vertical interruption in the dark, pale as a lime-washed wall, moving from left to right at the pace of a man who has nowhere in particular to be. It was tall. He put it at 7 feet later and then said he could not swear to it because there was nothing beside it to measure it against. No post, no shed, no other man. It stood higher than the top strand of the fence, and the fence was 5'6", and the shape crossed it at something close to the shoulder. That is the one measurement in the whole account that has an anchor in it, and it is worth holding on to, because everything else about that night dissolves the moment you press it. The colour is the detail every witness returned to. Not grey, not the dull silver of moonlight on a coat. White, the flat, chalky, sunless white of a plastered wall, or of the underside of a fish, or of skin that has been wet for a long time and then dried. It did not gleam. Frost gleams. Ice gleams. This did not. It absorbed the lamplight and gave nothing back, and the men who saw it in different weeks, from different corners of the perimeter, agreed on that without ever having compared notes, because they were not the sort of men who compared notes about such things. The trunk of it was smooth and unbroken, a column narrowing slightly toward the top, without any clear division where a neck should be, without any face he could describe. He looked for a face. He said so plainly. He looked for a face and found a smooth, blank taper, and his eye went down instead to the place where the arms were. There were arms. That is the part that unsettles people most when they read the words for the first time, because it would be easier if there had been nothing there at all. The trunk put out 2 limbs, roughly where a man's would be, and they hung down close against the body, and they ended, and this is the phrase from the ledger in the watchman's own spelling, and I will not improve it, they ended in stumps like the ends of candles. No hands. No fingers, no claws, no fists, no gloves, no bandaged mass, nothing bunched or curled, smooth, rounded terminations, as though the arms had been made in a mould and the mould simply stopped. He said they did not swing. That is a small thing, and it is the reason I spent 3 weeks inside this material before I wrote a word of it. When a man walks, his arms swing. When a bear walks, its forelimbs reach. When anything alive moves forward on the ground, the top half of it answers the bottom half. These did not. The stumps hung flat and still against the trunk while the thing carried itself along the wire, and the effect he tried to describe, badly in the language of a night watchman in a Yorkshire works, was of something being conveyed rather than something walking, because the bottom half was walking. The bottom half was doing all of it. Below the waist, and there was a waist, a clear narrowing, a place where the single column ended, the body divided, not into 2. The watchman counted. That is the sentence I keep coming back to, because it tells you something about the man and something about the duration of the encounter. He stood there long enough, and it moved slowly enough, and he was calm enough, or frozen enough, to count. 6 legs. 3 on the near side, 3 on the far side, thin as fence stakes, pale as the trunk above them, jointed somewhere in the middle in a way he could not resolve, and they moved in sequence, not together, not in the paired driving rhythm of a horse or a hound. In a rolling wave from front to back, one after another, each foot set down deliberately and lifted before the next came forward, and the whole procession of them so even, so metronomic, so entirely without hurry, that the body above stayed level as it passed. No bob, no sway. A man's head rises and falls when he walks, a beast's shoulders pitch. This glided along the fence line with its blank top held perfectly steady, borne on that unhurried rolling of 6 thin legs, and it made He was very clear about this, and so were the others. It made no sound at all. Frozen ground in December. Cinder path on the outside of the wire, laid the summer before, still loose. A grown man cannot cross 40 yards of that without being heard from the corner post. He heard nothing. He heard the works generator behind him and his own breathing, which he said became difficult, and the small tick of the frost in the wire, and nothing else. It did not look at him. It did not turn. It did not alter its pace by so much as a fraction when the lamp came up. It went along the outside of the fence from the north corner toward the west. At a distance he later paced out as 10 to 12 feet from the wire, never touching it, never straying. And where the fence turned, the shape turned with it and kept the same interval and went on. That is the detail that turns this from a ghost story into a problem. It was following the boundary, not wandering across the moor, not crossing the ground, not coming toward the gate or the huts or the light. It was tracing the line of the perimeter, keeping station off the wire the way a picket keeps station off a wall, and it went out of the lamplight still tracing it, still at that same rolling, unhurried pace, and the last he saw of it was the pale trunk passing the western angle of the fence, level and steady, with the 6 legs carrying it away into the dark toward the reservoir. He did not follow. He wrote it in the book because writing things in the book was the whole of his job, and the entry is dated and timed and initialed, and the time is 9:41. The next man to see it, 8 nights later at the same corner, wrote down 9:38, 9:41, 9:38. 3 minutes apart, across 8 nights at the same corner post, entered by 2 different men in 2 different hands. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is the thing that made me take the material seriously in the first place. A hallucination does not keep a timetable. A frightened man inventing a story to fill a cold shift does not invent a story that repeats to within 3 minutes and then hands it off to a colleague who invents the same one. The second entry is in a heavier hand, pressed hard enough that the pen scored the page beneath. It reads, as near as I can transcribe it, figure on cinder path, north corner, going west, as reported. No further action possible. And then, squeezed against the ruled margin where there was no proper room for it, 4 more words. Same as before, again. Same as before, again. A watchman writing for a foreman who will read the book at 7 in the morning does not write that unless the book already contains something he expects the foreman to remember. From that entry onward, the sightings stop being incidents and become a schedule. I have counted, from the surviving pages, 23 separate entries between the first week of December and the second week of February that record the shape on the perimeter. 23 in roughly 10 weeks. The earliest recorded time is 9:26. The latest is 10:04. Every single one of them falls inside a window of 38 minutes, and every single one of them places the figure on the outside of the wire, on the cinder path, moving from the north corner toward the west. Never the reverse. Not once in 23 entries does anybody record it walking the other way around. And here I have to be honest with you about the shape of the evidence, because the shape of the evidence is part of the story. These are not dramatic entries. They are bored. They are the entries of men who have stopped being amazed. By the middle of January, the language has flattened into the dialect of routine, figure as usual, north to west. No incident. One page carries the notation seen, timed, nothing to add. Another simply says, as before, with the time beside it. Whatever was walking that fence, the men on the night gate had absorbed it into their working lives the way you absorb a goods train that passes at a fixed hour. They did not solve it. They filed it. That, I have come to think, is the most disturbing thing in the whole ledger. Not the fear, the end of the fear. Now the wage books. I went to them for a dull reason. I wanted to know how many men were actually on that gate, because a legend grows in proportion to the number of mouths available to grow it. What the wage books gave me instead was a labour pattern that does not make sense unless something on that perimeter was making the job unbearable. The night gate at the compound was established on the evidence of the pay sheets, with a standing complement of 4, 2 on the gate itself, 2 walking the boundary in opposite directions on a fixed circuit. It is an ordinary arrangement for a works of that size in that period. Between the beginning of December and the middle of February, 11 different names pass through those 4 positions. 11. Men are engaged for a fortnight and paid off. 1 name appears for 3 nights and never again. 2 men are recorded as transferred to day labour at their own request, and the phrase "at his own request" is written twice on the same sheet, in the same hand, as though the clerk had been given a form of words and told to use it. A works loses men in winter. Men leave for better pay, for warmer work, for a farm, for a ship. But a works that is losing men from one specific shift on one specific gate at a rate of 11 bodies through 4 posts in 10 weeks is a works with a problem on that gate. And the wage books, being wage books, will not tell you what the problem was. They will only show you the hole it left in the payroll. 2 of those 11 names matter more than the others. The first belongs to a man engaged in the last week of November and paid off in the 3rd week of January. I will not give you the full name because his descendants can be traced and have asked, through a local historian, not to be involved, and I will honour that. He is the man who followed it. The ledger records that on a night in the middle of January he left the gate. The entry is not in his hand, it is in the hand of the man he left behind. And the entry says, and this is the phrase, "went out at the wicket after the figure." Time noted, 9:52. The next line, in the same hand, says returned 10:31. 39 minutes outside the wire, on the cinder path, in January, on a moor, following a thing that had been walking that fence unexplained for 6 weeks. And when he came back through the wicket, according to every version of the account that survives, he could not say what he had seen. Not, would not, could not. The distinction is preserved in 2 independent sources, and they do not agree about much else. He was not raving. He was not injured. He sat in the gatehouse with the door shut and gave answers to questions for something over an hour, and the answers, in the words of one account, did not join up. He agreed he had followed it. He agreed he had got close to it. Asked how close, he gave a distance and then gave a different one. Asked what it did when he got close, he described the legs, the number of them, the way they placed themselves, and then stopped, and when pressed, described the legs again, in the same words, as though the sentence were the only part of the memory that had survived intact. He worked 4 more nights on the day gate, and then he was paid off, and the wage book gives no reason, and he does not appear in any record of that works again. The second name is the reason there is an inquest fragment at all. He was engaged on the 11th of February, which the pay sheet confirms, at the standing night rate. He is recorded present on the 12th, the 13th, the 14th. On the 15th, there is no entry against his name at all. Not absent, not sick, not the small notation the clerk used for a man who did not turn in. Just the ruled line and the space where the figures should be left empty. And then, 3 pages later, at the end of the month, his name reappears in the settlement column with an amount paid against it and the word due written beside it in a different ink. That is what a wage book looks like when a man's final money is paid to somebody who is not the man. The inquest paper that survives is 1 leaf, and it is a copy of a copy, and I want to be careful with it. It carries no name in the portion that remains. It records that a body was recovered from water at the edge of a works reservoir, that identification was made by a fellow workman, and that the deceased had last been seen at his employment. The finding, in the standard formula of the period, is death by misadventure. And in the space where a coroner sometimes adds a remark, there is 1 sentence, and the sentence is, "No evidence was offered as to why the deceased was beyond the boundary fence. No evidence was offered, not none existed. None was offered. He was outside the wire, in the dark, in February, and nobody in that room stood up to say why a man on the night gate would be found on the wrong side of his own perimeter, on the cinder path, at the western end, in the water beyond it. The perimeter patrol ends in the wage books 11 days later. The 2 walking posts vanish from the pay sheets and are never reinstated. From the first week of March, the night complement is 2 men, both on the gate, and the boundary is not walked at all. They did not solve it. They stopped going out to meet it. And that is where the story ought to become easier. A works compound, a coroner, a pay office, a company with a registered address. These are the things that leave sediment. Buildings have plans. Boundaries have surveys. Deaths have registers. I went into this expecting the ordinary frustration of a thin file. What I found instead was something closer to a hollow, a place where the paper should be and is not, and where the shape of the absence is neater than any accident I know how to explain. The compound itself is the simplest loss. It was levelled in stages, the way industrial ground almost always is. The sheds first, then the standing plant, then the boundary. There is a wartime requisition, a change of use, a demolition in the middle of the century, and then the flat, honest emptiness of a site that has been cleared twice. If you stand where the western fence ran, you are standing on hardcore and grass and the back of somebody else's access road. There is no ruin to visit. There is no line of posts marching off into a field. Whatever the 6 legs were pacing around, the ground has been scraped and relaid over it so thoroughly that the original contour is gone. I want to be honest, this is not sinister. This is Britain. 99 sites in 100 end exactly this way, and the fact that ours did too proves nothing at all. The ledger is different. The ledger I cannot make ordinary. The shift book, the one with the arrival times, the same hour written again and again in a tired hand, the marginal notes that get shorter as the weeks go on, survives as a bound volume in a local collection, and the binding is where the story stops being about a creature and starts being about a person with a knife. Pages have been removed, not torn, not burnt, not lost to damp. Removed at the gutter, close in with a blade, in a way that leaves the stubs seated in the stitching. You can count them. You can put a finger on the cut edge. The volume runs continuously to the end of the 2nd week of February, and then the paper changes character in your hand because for a stretch of days there is nothing between the boards but the residue of what used to be there. And here is the detail that has kept me up. The excision is not random and it is not generous. It does not remove the sightings. It removes the last of them and the days that follow. Everything up to the 14th is there, in full, in the watchman's own patient script. The shape, the pace, the direction, the refusal to cross the wire. What has been taken is the interval that would contain the night the 2nd man went out and the mornings afterward when somebody had to write down what the gate looked like without him. The narrative survives. The consequence does not. Somebody sat with that book, decided the creature could stay, and cut out the man. I cannot tell you who. There is no annotation, no initial, no accession note that admits the volume arrived incomplete. The collection's own record simply describes it as a shift ledger with pages wanting, which is the kind of phrase archivists write 100 times a year, honestly and without suspicion, because pages are always wanting. Rats want pages. Solicitors want pages. Sons who are ashamed of their fathers want pages. The quiet erasure I keep returning to in these films does not require a conspiracy, and it almost never gets one. It requires a company secretary who is frightened of a claim, or a foreman who is protecting a widow's settlement, or an old man in 1949 sorting a dead employer's cupboard, deciding that some things are nobody's business and doing a tidy job with a penknife on a winter afternoon. That is all it takes. One person, once, with a reason that seemed decent to them. Then there is the photograph. And I have to disappoint you carefully because the photograph is the reason most people find this story at all. It circulates as the image, a tall, pale, vertical mass at the edge of a wire boundary, taken at distance, low light, the ground white, the shape narrowing towards the top and splaying at the base into something that the eye insists on reading as too many legs. It is genuinely unsettling. It is also, as far as I can establish, not a photograph of this at all. The print carries a photographer's blind stamp and a plate reference, and the plate reference sits inside a sequence that can be dated, and it dates to the summer before, more than half a year ahead of the first ledger entry. The vegetation is wrong for February, the shadows are wrong for the hour. It is a works record shot of a boundary and a piece of standing equipment made for an entirely dull reason, and it cannot show what the watchman described because it was exposed before any of them described anything. So the famous image is not evidence. It is worse than not evidence. It is contamination, because for 80 years people have been arguing about the resolution of a pale smear that was never in the story, and while they argue, nobody reads the wage book. Now let me make the case against myself, properly, because it is a strong one, and I will not pretend otherwise. The skeptical explanation goes like this, and it needs 3 ordinary things braided together. First, a hoax. 1913 is deep in the age of the stilt walker, and stilts explain a great deal. They explain the height. They explain the stiff, rolling, unhurried gait that no animal makes, because it is not an animal's gait, it is a man's gait with the cadence stretched. They even explain the stumps, because a man walking on 2 hand crutches has his forearms buried and his silhouette ends in blunt nothing at the shoulder line. Second, the tripod, a surveyor's instrument left standing overnight, splay-legged, pale timber, frost-lit at the edge of a boundary being remeasured for the very requisition that later cleared the site, a thing that is legitimately 3-legged and, doubled by fence shadow at the wrong angle, reads as 6. Third, the death. A tired man on a February night on a cinder path near open water, and water at the edge of works reservoirs killed men constantly and unremarkably, and death by misadventure is not a euphemism, it is usually just true. Braid those 3, hand them to men working 12-hour nights in the cold, and a legend assembles itself without anybody lying. I find this persuasive. I want you to know that I find it persuasive. It accounts for the shape, the pace, the stumps, the count of legs, the body, the coroner's formula, and the sudden institutional wish to stop talking about any of it. What it does not account for is the root. A hoaxer on stilts does not come at the same hour for weeks. Hoaxers escalate or they get bored. A tripod does not move, and the ledger has the shape passing the western end and continuing, timed, with intervals recorded between posts. And neither a prankster nor a piece of surveying equipment explains the one thing the watchmen were most consistent about and least interested in, the detail they wrote down because it was simply what happened. It went the same way round, every night, never reversing, never crossing, always outside the wire. That is not a fright, that is a circuit, and a circuit has a centre. So I went looking for the centre, not for the figure. I had exhausted the figure. I went looking for what a closed loop drawn in the snow at Fenwick's works in the winter of 1913 would have had inside it, because a circuit is a geometry, and geometry survives longer than testimony. Fences rot, witnesses recant or die or are gently reclassified as unreliable. But the shape of a boundary gets recorded because boundaries are property, and property is the one thing the 19th and 20th centuries wrote down with religious care. The compound is gone. I have said that. But the outline of it is not gone because it is still in the deposited plans and it is still in the drainage. I spent an afternoon with the Ordnance Survey 25-inch sheets, the 1898 revision and the 1919 revision laid side by side, and I traced the perimeter the watchman walked. It is not a square. It is not the tidy rectangle you would draw if somebody asked you to sketch a works compound from memory. It is a 5-sided figure, and the 5th side is the strange one, a long, shallow curve running away from the main plant on the northeast, bowing outward around something and then returning. Boundaries do not bow for no reason. A boundary bows because something is in the way, and the thing in the way is usually one of three things: water, a right-of-way, or a burial. There is no watercourse marked inside that bow on either sheet. There is no footpath. The 1898 sheet shows the enclosure and, within the bow, an area of rough ground with the stippling that surveyors used for undifferentiated waste, and one small structure, unlabelled, roughly 9 feet by 12, drawn with a thin single line that means an unroofed or ruinous wall rather than a building in use. On the 1919 sheet, the structure is gone, and the stippling is gone, and the whole bow is inside a wash of new hatching, because by 1919 the site has been extended and levelled, and the rough ground has become plant. The interesting fact is not that it vanished. Everything on that site vanished. The interesting fact is that between those two surveys, in a company that was expanding aggressively into every square yard it owned, that 9 by 12 patch of waste ground sat unused for at least 21 years, inside its own outward bow, in the middle of a works that was buying land at the boundary because it had run out of room within it. I want to be very careful here because this is the point in an investigation like this where a researcher stops reporting and starts composing. So let me tell you precisely what I have and precisely what I do not. I have the bow. I have the unroofed structure. I have the 21 years of disuse. I have one line in the 1907 valuation description of the Fenwick's holding in the schedule of the northern parcels, which describes the northeastern portion as, and I am quoting the schedule exactly, waste with ancient enclosure not built upon. Ancient enclosure. That is a valuer's phrase, and it is a lazy one, and it can mean anything from a medieval field wall to a sheep pen to something a valuer did not want to look at closely on a wet Tuesday. And I have one more thing, and it is the last document in this story, and it is the smallest. In the minute book of the Works Committee, the volume that covers 1911 to 1915, at the meeting of the 14th of March 1913, 3 weeks after the death, 2 weeks after the perimeter patrol was quietly folded into the gatehouse duty and stopped being a patrol at all, there is an item under general business. It is 4 lines long. It records that the committee considered a request and that the request was refused, and it does not say who made it. What it says is that the committee declined to sanction the removal of the old walling in the northeast parcel, the matter not being one of works maintenance. And then, in the same sentence, and this is the part I have read perhaps 200 times, and being minded that the men should not be given occasion. Occasion. Not cause, not reason. Occasion. Somebody asked to take down the old wall. The committee said no, and the stated ground for saying no was not cost and not safety, and not that it served any purpose. The stated ground was that pulling it down would give the men occasion. Occasion to do what? To talk, to gather, to look. To look for what? I cannot answer that. I have no more paper. The next volume of the Minute Book, 1916 to 1921, has no reference to the northeast parcel at all, and by then the parcel is under 6 inches of clinker and a rolling mill, and whatever the walling was is either underneath it or was broken up and used as hard core, which is what happened to almost every ancient enclosure in industrial England, without ceremony and without record. So here is where the investigation ends, and I'm going to put it as plainly as I can, because the temptation now is to be grand, and I want to resist it. There was a shape. It was recorded in a clerk's hand, in a ledger kept for the mundane purpose of proving that men had been where they were paid to be. It came at the same hour. It went the same way round. It stayed outside the wire, always, on a route that bowed outward around a patch of waste ground with an old wall on it that the company would not let anyone touch and could not find a use for in 21 years. 2 men went past the gate after it. One came back and never described it. One did not come back. The patrol ended. The pages were cut out at the binding. The photograph that survives is the wrong photograph, from the wrong year, showing a pale, accidental smear on a fence line that cannot be the thing because it predates the thing, and it has been reproduced 90-odd times anyway, because a bad picture of a mystery travels further than a good document about it. And now go back with me, one last time, to the beginning. It is a little after 2 in the morning. The frost has come down hard enough that the cinder path rings under a boot. Along the outside of the wire, moving northeast, at the pace of a man who has somewhere to be but is in no hurry to arrive, there is a tall, chalk-white shape. Its trunk ends in smooth, blunt stumps where hands should be. Below the waist, it forks into 6 thin legs, and they place themselves in that rolling, unhurried, alternating rhythm that no animal on this island has ever walked with. And it does not look at the fence, and it does not look at the man watching it from inside the fence, and it does not stop. It is walking a line. It has walked that line before, and it will walk it tomorrow. It keeps the wire on its left shoulder the whole way round, which means the enclosure and the waste ground and the low old wall in the middle of it are always on its left, always beside it, always the thing it is turning around. And that is the question the ledger asks and never answers, the question the committee minute brushes with 4 careful words and then closes for good. The question that is still under the clinker somewhere in the northeast of a site that no longer exists. It walked the perimeter every night, always the same direction, always outside the wire. So what was in the middle? And was it walking round it to keep the rest of us out, or to make sure that whatever was in there stayed in?